Hi everyone, today I want to talk about the rogues in Diablo 4. In particular, all of their faults and their problems. So rogues right now are actually in a relatively good spot in terms of the overall class balance. They have received quite some substantial buffs, some good builds this season 4, but there are a lot of issues that I think should be addressed at least in the long term. So number one, this is a bit of like a discussion video and stuff that I have been talking about on my streams, for example, about various topics related to rogues. And on the other hand, I also want to give some feedback to the devs and maybe some food for thought. I don't really expect like a huge turnaround on all of these issues immediately. It's like middle of season 4 soon. Maybe there's going to be some stuff in the middle update or so, but ultimately season 5 maybe there might be some stuff, and then we also have the expansion just around the corner. So I really hope to see at least some sweeping changes being made there, because there are systematic problems that the rogue class has. Other classes do too, by the way, and I might cover those as well. But for now, I'm going to start with this. So with that being said, I have prepared a topic list here. I will not go necessarily one by one exactly through those points, because there's a lot of overlap here between different topics. But I want to talk about especially melee builds, crowd control effects, the defenses, the key passes, the ultimates, the uniques, and some more little topics here that I have gathered and discussed at various points. So let me know what you think about this as well. Maybe you have some other ideas, maybe some other problems that I didn't really identify now or didn't mention now. Anything helps, I guess, but let's get into it. So let's start with the first topic here, the melee builds. So melee rogues have been kind of like the dominant meta for quite a while when the game came out. We had the Twisting Blades rogue, in particular the poison versions of that were hilariously bugged and completely cracked. So this has been addressed back in season 3 actually, so it took a long time for the devs to fix that, but there were various bugs that made those poison melee builds, in particular Twisting Blades, way more powerful than they should have been. So since then, melee builds have been pretty down bad, really. They are really terrible when you compare them to some of the other top builds. For example, if you look at our pit tier list here right now, so they're not the only bad builds in the game, but if you look at Twisting Blades rogue, Grenade rogue, Shadow Step as well, there's Flurry down here all alone in F. Like, it's not looking good for the melee rogues in general. And this is not necessarily just thanks to those bug fixes, which I've been advocating for and waiting for a long time until it finally happened, but it's also thanks to just the lack of scaling mechanisms that those melee rogues have. So I've been playing those builds actually in season 4 already. I have also played them on the PTR already, and my judgment has not really changed. They are down there in C or F tier or D tier. At that point, it doesn't really matter all that much, I suppose. And we have all of the ranged rogues here that are kind of like very far up. We have the Heartseeker rogue, that's like the hot new thing of the season basically. They have the Rapid Fire rogue, they're really powerful right now as well with the new unique ring. And there's also Penshot and some other stuff that we also have up here. Barrage, Death Trap rogue, there's also Barrage build basically. And in general, rogue, like the ranged rogues are eating pretty well, while the melee rogues are kind of starving. And this is mainly due to their key passes, I would say. So we can take a look at what the key passes actually do for the different builds, and then I guess you will also understand why this happens. So we have 5 key passes on the rogue. We have one that is like completely melee themed. We have one that is melee and ranged hybrid. We have one that is ranged themed. Then we have one that is completely out of the ordinary, the Victimized. This is a hot new thing for season 4. And we have the grenade themed key passive, Exposure. So they all have kind of like their own, little quirks and their own like reasons to be used. However, we have in particular one key passive that stands out by far the most compared to almost any other key passive in the game actually, and that is Precision. So Precision, when the game launched, was a relatively weak key passive, but it was useful and it was still giving quite some benefits, in particular for non-combo point builds. So back then, for example, I made like a preparation, Death Trap, like a Precision, Rapid Fire build without combo points, for example. That was a really fun build actually, and that later evolved actually into the Rain of Arrows build as well. But well, we had a key passive that basically rewarded you for critting with your skills, and then every time you reach those maximum stacks of precision, you get like a guaranteed crit on all of the arrows from the next skill fired, and they would also deal more damage. So that's how it used to work, which was way weaker than what it is now. Now it has a very natural synergy with combo point builds, in a way that Your basic attacks cannot consume precision stacks, which was a thing back then. That was a very welcome change. However, it kind of like made combo point ranged rogues completely cracked compared to anything else you can do. So what happened is that you just build your combo points 1, 2, 3. At the same time, you build those precision stacks 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually those two things overlap perfectly so that you do 3 attacks and then release your super charged up 100% crit chance, mega crit damage core skill. So that's kind of how ranged rogue works in general right now. So this means that non-combo point ranged rogues are kind of like, yeah, scuffed right now because they don't really have great scaling options, and combo point rogues have been dominant for quite a while, in particular ranged ones with precision. And fully stacked up with like a lot of crit damage, this can mean something like a ×4, ×5, or even more damage bonus, which is like completely busted when compared to what other key passes give on, you know, just the rogue or also other classes. Then we have Victimize. So Victimize right now is also kind of like a crazy good key pass that is used in 2 of the top builds on rogue. One is the Heartseeker and one is the Penshot rogue. So Victimize for the longest time was bugged and actually did not benefit from a lot of damage multipliers. Then it has been buffed multiple times. It has gotten a higher like a hit chance and it got this vulnerable damage scaling, so that now it can cause these damage explosions that deal like multiple amounts of damage of the original hit, and it can do so pretty frequently thanks to the lucky hit chances. And on top of this, we have some double dipping bugs of this that have been introduced in Season 4, making those victimized rogues even stronger than they should be. So this is mostly why Heartseeker is that far at the top. Without those double dipping bugs, victimized rogues would still be fairly good, at least the Heartseeker and Penshot builds, but not really like necessarily top dogs anymore. However, there's one big issue with the Victimized key passive, and that is it can only be used with very specific skills thanks to the lucky hit requirement. This is actually feedback I gave multiple times already to Blizzard, but for some reason it has never changed and I don't know why. But basically what Victimize does is it scales 2 different factors. One is the damage of the hit and one is the lucky hit chance of the hit. And it doesn't make any sense whatsoever for Victimize to work that way. I think it just punishes like low lucky hit skills unnecessarily, and it's effectively unusable with low lucky hit skills altogether. So the reason why it's used is because Heartseeker has a base lucky hit chance of 50% and Penshot has a base lucky hit chance of 50%, giving you actually like a reasonable expectation to get a victimized pop whenever you use them. In fact, you can even buff the lucky hit chance from Penshot here with combo points. You can go to 80 or even 90 with the legendary Paragon node, Cunning Stratagem. So you can have a lot of lucky hit chance. And if you ever want to think about using Victimize on any build that does not use either Penshot or Heartseeker, then, well, you're not going to have success with this, because the lucky hit chance of stuff like Barrage is 16, Rapid Fire is 20, we have Flurry with 10%, and also Twisting Blades is not that crazy, especially with the Blade Dancer aspect. So apparently there was like a stealth nerf here that basically divided the lucky hit chance into multiple hits in Twisting Blades. So this means that there's really only one core skill that could ever even dream about using Victimize, which is Penshot, and Heartseeker just turned out to be like strong enough thanks to all of the basic attack buffs that we have gotten lately, with like Moonrise aspects, adaptability aspects, and basic skill ranks and so on. So in general, Victimize is just kind of like poorly designed, I think. It's basically area damage from Diablo 3, but it has this lucky hit component as well, which just makes 0 sense because skills are already balanced by the damage. And on top of this, you have this balanced damage, and you have the lucky hit chance to play a role. So this means that it can never be useful for anything that's not Penshot, basically, with the current design. So this is basically how that works. And well, we have a Heartseeker right now, so who knows if that's gonna stick around. But I think Victimize will probably need an update. And lastly, we have Exposure. So Exposure is actually a very cool key passive. I really love this one. This was like the original key passive that I used, for example, for the Death Trap Rogue back in the launch race for Season 0 for the World First. Exposure, Death Trap, Twisting Blades Rogue, that was really cool stuff because it gives you like those cooldown resets. You throw the Poison Trap, then you can do a Death Trap like every 1 or 2 seconds or every pack at least or something like that. Really cool stuff. And it also drops these stun grenades down on the ground. So these days, Exposure is not really such a thing anymore because a lot of these key passes have been buffed to the moon, in particular Precision, as I talked about. Victimize is really good right now, and even Close Quarters Combat has received quite some buffs since launch as well. So it's just not really cutting it for a key passive that doesn't actually add any offensive benefit, basically. So yeah, using your Death Trap a bit more often is nice and all, but Death Trap itself doesn't really do anything. It's just like for the pull, basically, and sometimes for synergies like preparation to reset your skills. But those grenades that come out of this apparently are not even buffed by the grenade aspects, or maybe not all of them. So if you want to do a grenade build, you have to do it in a different way and not with the exposure key passive. And you're actually better off using, for example, close quarters combat for a grenade build in order to buff those grenades damage instead of just having more grenades from exposure. So this is kind of like where we're at. And then there's momentum, which these days really has no use whatsoever anymore. This is also something I used quite a bit back in the past when the other key passes were not as powerful as they are now. This damage reduction was very welcome back when the game was significantly just harder and more dangerous, especially on hardcore. And these days, this 20% damage reduction, yeah, it's still nice to have, but you can't afford taking this when you have these more powerful options. And there's close quarters combat that used to be used for like the more offensive melee builds in particular, that gives you like this attack speed buff, and also it was improved to also scale with damage to crowd controlled enemies. And overall, if you heavily invest into this, you can get something like a ×2 or so damage output, which is relatively powerful and definitely blows away some of these other key passives here for melee builds. Ultimately though, if you look at the key passives, then you see that close quarters combat is significantly weaker than precision, so there's like a natural gap that forms here between melee builds using close quarters combat, because they're forced to. It's the only option that actually gives the damage. And then there's the range builds that can use precision, and they have, you know, the guaranteed crits, and they have like this, you know, ×5 damage output. And there are some other factors that go into the low viability of many builds, which is you have to stack different stats for both these key passes here. So this one works with damage to crowd control enemies, and this one works with crit damage. And well, luckily with precision, all of your damage, at least all of your relevant damage output, does crit, because you get a guaranteed crit every single time on all of your arrows. So that's really strong, and it always works, which is kind of the key point here. And then we have the close quarters combat passive that makes you stack crowd control damage bonus. So it does work against all enemies with the key passive, but the crowd control damage itself does not work against all enemies until you actually apply a crowd control. So you have to daze them, stun them, whatever. And most importantly, it doesn't even work against bosses until they are staggered, which is a topic I'm going to go into in a second. But all of this just contributes to melee rogues just being kind of like bad, basically, despite maybe the numbers on the core skills themselves not even looking all that bad. If you compare the damage numbers of Twisting Blades and Flurry to those of like Pen Shot or Rapid Fire and so on, like at the baseline, without key passes, without legendary aspects, without specializations and so on, they're not even really that far off. And you know, at level 10 or so, you can definitely feel powerful with any of them. But then basically, as you progress your character, the gap widens more and more and more, thanks to those different scaling mechanisms that those different skills have. And there's just kind of a clear lack of support for melee skills in here. And not only that, you can't even play like a real melee rogue if I really wanted. So this leads me to another topic here, which is basic attacks. So the way to play a melee rogue is to play with puncture to activate the close quarters combat buff, and then use whatever melee skill you want to use, like Twisting Blades or Flurry. You have to use one of these ranged abilities, because else you don't even get the damage buff in the first place. You need to have both these buffs active for close quarters combat. So this is effectively, you know, the melee plus ranged key passive that is exclusively used for melee builds and not for ranged builds. Really, there is like an exception that I made lately, but ultimately precision is the way for ranged, and this is the way for melee. And the actual melee key passive is just kind of like completely pointless. So you're kind of like forced to play like a not really melee build, because you have to use one of the ranged basic attacks, which is usually puncture, because it just has the kind of like best utility, has a fast attack animation, it just feels good. So I don't really have a problem with puncturing necessarily, but there's not even like a reason to even consider something like Blade Shift or Invigorating Strike. It is also further amplified by other effects that we have, for example, in the Paragon boards. So we have like a natural synergy for these close quarter combat builds with the Tricks of the Trade key, legendary node here, for example, where if you ever don't play a poison build, let's say, you can use Tricks of the Trade, and you can actually like get a 25% damage buff for free while also activating your close quarter combat effect. But you can never really consider like playing like Blade Shift and Twisting Blades, or like Invigorating Strike and Twisting Blades or something like that. It just doesn't happen. And then there's another really obvious problem that the rogues have that I think should be addressed, which is Dark Shroud. So Dark Shroud is kind of like the only reason why rogues actually function right now, in the pit at least, or in like any kind of like end game challenging content. Dark Shrouds give you a ridiculous amount of damage reduction. Even with one rank only, you get up to 40% damage reduction from this. And, well, a lot of builds can keep up those Dark Shrouds very easily, in particular the ranged builds, thanks to the Amber's aspect. I always get questions about this. How does that work when you don't have it on your bar? Well, there's this little aspect here that gives you free Dark Shrouds when you crit with Marksman skills. Marksman skills being all of the ranged abilities. So this includes Puncture, for example. And again, we go back to the topic of melee rogues. Puncture, again, has high lucky hit chance. Gives you these multiple hits, gives you multiple chances to proc it, and so on. You have a lot of like natural synergies for close quarter combat for this like ranged plus melee combo, because Puncture can also give you those Dark Shroud stacks. And likewise for all of the ranged builds, it's very easy to produce them because of Precision Key passive or because of high lucky hit chances for victimized builds. So all of the ranged builds just kind of like run Umbers anyway. You get insane amounts of damage reduction, and even the melee builds, they have to use this because they could not survive otherwise. So it's also just like a factor of Dark Shrouds just being too powerful in my book. Like, I don't want to nerf the rogue overall defense, but I think that the gap between having Dark Shrouds up and not having Dark Shrouds up is way too large, and there's basically no conceivable rogue build that does not run Dark Shroud. There's like no way you could ever leave this out of a rogue build currently. So this means a full melee build will never function because, well, you don't have Dark Shrouds. And, well, in general, you have like this very spiky, like, you know, really high damage taken sometimes when you get like multiple small hits and your Dark Shrouds deplete very quickly. Versus you can very easily survive like the slow, you know, individual big hits basically. So I kind of like the general idea of Dark Shroud, but I think that especially with all of the skill ranks we can stack these days, boosting Dark Shrouds to something like 70% or more damage reduction, it just gets kind of too much. And at that point, I think we should consider maybe a nerf to Dark Shroud, or maybe other ways to generate them more frequently, especially for melee rogues. Ultimately though, I think there is too much power involved in like a single passive here, or in a single like skill basically, that you proc passively from one aspect. And as I mentioned, like it can feel kind of odd because, you know, you walk in at the start of the run, you have 0 Dark Shrouds, and suddenly you just get chunked by like a small attack or so until you actually build up your Dark Shrouds, or, you know, you shoot into like an elite pack that has lighting enchanted and like lots of these little lighting orbs that don't necessarily do much damage to you, hit you, deplete all of your stacks, and then there comes the follow-up attack and you're just dead or something. So in general, I think it just like feels too spiky, it's too much roller coaster compared to the defenses that other classes have, on top of the trouble that it produces for melee rogue builds. I would definitely like to see like some changes here, and maybe also just like some new defensive options that apply to rogues and can be used by other builds as well. And not just Dark Shrouds every single time on every single rogue build in order to even survive the most basic of things. We do have quite some defensive options on the rogue tree. For example, there's Agile that gives us dodge, but again, this doesn't help us, for example, for one-shots. Then we have Debilitating Toxins, which is very powerful. Unfortunately, doesn't work for pit shadow bosses, for example, because it's a conditional effect applied to the enemy. And other than that, we don't have all that many defenses here. There's also Sturdy up there, I suppose, which is like a kind of nice damage reduction passive, especially for melee rogues. There's a little bit on the Paragons, but also a lot of conditional effects here. So we have, for example, Deadly Ambush Board, where trapped enemies deal less damage to you. Again, doesn't work against shadow bosses in the pit. Then we also have stuff like Cheap Shot, so this goes into like every single rogue build as well. Safeguard, you just need that damage reduction basically, and I mean that's kind of okay. It's like a very powerful, you know, cluster here. But again, it further amplifies also like some problems with like these crowd control effects and conditional effects that I talked about earlier with close quarters combat. You have damage versus crowd control. You generally want to crowd control enemies, but it doesn't always work, in particular bosses and shadow bosses in the pit. And so a lot of the stuff doesn't necessarily apply. But you always kind of like naturally end up as a rogue on the Cheap Shot board, which means you naturally have Cheap Shot in your build. You naturally have a bunch of these conditional effects here, like damage reduction on slowed enemies. You have damage reduction, damage to crowd controlled enemies. So it kind of like always feeds into the same machine of you have to crowd control enemies in order to get both your offensive and your defensive effects, basically. And outside of just stacking a lot of life, there's not really any other real defensive options that you could go for as a rogue. So most of my rogue builds just end up with something like 40-50k life, on top of having, like, for example, stuff like Safeguard and stuff like Cunning Node, and, you know, stuff like Wiles as well, and even like Debilitating Toxins. And you just stack all this stuff in order to, like, not randomly get one tap whenever your Dark Shadow is down, for example. So in general, I would say there's definitely need for like a bit of a defensive revamp here on the rogues as well. And of course, we need some revamp of the key passives. We have like a completely melee themed key passive that's absolutely pointless right now. Then this one here, which works with damage to crowd controlled enemies, which is just kind of like negatively affecting melee builds in general, because again, damage to crowd controlled enemies, while it's just additive damage, you stack a lot of it in modern builds. You have like 1000% or so of damage to crowd controlled enemies, and then maybe have like another, let's say 500% or so of other additive damage. This means that whenever you fight a boss that is not staggered, like 2/3 of your damage is just kind of turned off until you stagger the boss, which is kind of a major problem that these melee builds also have. It's kind of like a major problem of rogues in general though, but more amplified for the melee rogues because of close quarters combat. If you look at how rogues actually deal damage in the pit against the bosses in particular, you'll see that there's a huge reliance on these crowd control effects, even for the ranged builds, for Heartseeker, Victimized builds, whatever, because also stuff like Frigid Finesse exists. We have stuff like the Control Glyph that gives you extra damage against stunned and frozen enemies. So we have all these kind of like conditional effects that also play a role there in having like these huge bursts when you stagger the boss, and then like no damage when you don't. So this works just fine when you are fighting normal monsters, because, well, you crowd control them for up to 5 seconds and then become unstoppable for a few seconds if they live, and then you can crowd control them again. And you can kind of play around that when you like go through a run, for example. But whenever you get to the boss, none of the stuff works, and you have like, you know, only 1/6 or something of the damage output when the boss is not staggered versus when the boss is staggered. There's like a huge gap, and if you compare this to other classes, it just doesn't feel great when you have to rely on these conditional effects and on the stagger. In particular, if you try to go for like a high pit push, so I've been doing this, for example, in a rogue, when you have those 4, 5, 6 minute boss fights or so, you can stagger the boss a few times, usually 4 times, maybe in a very long fight 5 times, but that's basically it. You cannot stagger the boss more than that, because they become more and more resistant to stagger. So you have a few burst phases right at the start, and then you very slowly drain the health bar over multiple minutes, and then maybe comes another stagger and maybe finish them off or something like that. So this is just kind of like a common like disease that rogues have on all of the builds. I guess also to some degree the Zorks, they also have like a load of these conditional effects, but I think it's probably the most noticeable here on the rogues. And it's not really the case for other classes, like, you know, barbs, they don't really have this kind of stuff. This kind of like bash, you know, until the boss is dead. And also a lot of other classes don't really have that problem. Like Necros, you just walk in, you press your buttons, yeah, Druids, you know, you don't really have these kind of conditional stagger-related effects that only kick in at certain moments. So I think that maybe we also need some kind of like maybe general revamp of bosses in that sense, with like how crowd controls apply to them or how you can apply conditional effects to them. But overall, maybe it's just like a problem also that these conditional effects are so powerful and there's no alternatives to them. If you play a rogue, you will run Frigid Finesse on every single build, no question, because it's so easy to freeze enemies in 2024 thanks to tempers. You can just literally put one mod on your pants here, and you have your freeze chance, maybe put like even a second one somewhere for more consistency, and this is how you activate Frigid Finesse. And you would never dream about not taking Frigid Finesse. So you'll always have this kind of gap in your builds where you fight trash, you CC them, all fine. Then you go to the boss, you do like a stagger, do a big burst. And if the boss is not dead, then you're gonna cry. So this is how it works on every single rogue build, thanks to stuff like Frigid Finesse and, well, us not having alternatives. There are some other damage passes, but you usually just kind of take them by default. There's Exploit, there's Malice. So these are more universal. There's Weapon Mastery, but it doesn't apply to poison builds, for example. Instead, we have some poison passes here, okay. But ultimately, it always comes back to you have to include Frigid Finesse, because else your build sucks. And, well, you're gonna suck against the bosses anyway. If there were more options for like actually viable damage passes that maybe you could get a buff, that, would just help us out in more situations than when enemies are frozen. We actually do have some on the tree. They're just kind of like really worthless. So for example, precision imbuement, like 3% crit chance only while the skill is imbued. It's just not really cutting it. It's just too little, for example, to be like a viable option here most of the time. Same with like trap mastery, for example. You get a bunch of crit when you activate a trap. Yeah, it's nice, but no one would ever pick this over Frigid Finesse, even in a scenario that you are going for like a 6-minute boss kill, for example, because those Frigid Finesse passes, all these points are just so much more valuable, through the rest of the run, and it just kind of feels bad when you fight bosses. Now, another topic I want to talk about is Caltrops. So we have seen like the victory march of Caltrops, especially now in Season 4. Caltrops has been a skill that was not really used very much. It had like this very like situational utility, like you jump backwards and then you leave this slow field behind, and yeah, it does have some kind of offensive power boost. For example, we used to have the methodical Caltrops for the chill. So back, for example, in Abattoir of Zir, when we didn't have free access to chilling and freezing enemies all the time through the tempers, we used this actually in order to, well, activate Frigid Finesse yet again. So this was just like a very powerful boost. And these days we mostly rely on the enhanced Caltrops here. So we have this effect that makes enemies take more damage while they are in Caltrops. And I kind of understand the thinking here. They wanted to make Caltrops more viable, and no one really wanted to use Caltrops. It's like a slow skill that should be rewarded for, taking the time off your DPS rotation, jumping and putting down the Caltrops, and I kind of get it. But now we have the opposite problem, that Caltrops is just like everywhere, and it just doesn't necessarily feel like great to use. It does have this jump mechanic, and it's something that you don't necessarily want to do on a lot of builds. You can go back to the melee topic. For example, like why would you want to jump away from the enemy as a melee rogue, for example, or these kind of things. Same with barrage rogues even, because they're mostly like very like, shotgunny basically, right in the monster's vicinity. So you don't necessarily want that jump, but you have to rely on the Caltrops in order to deal good damage for rogue late game builds, in particular for the bosses. And then there's another thing, which is Caltrops duration. So you can temper this on your weapons. So this is done usually on, like, for example, 2 melee weapons. So you can put a lot of Caltrops duration there. So I have that here. 45% baseline, and Masterwork at RP can get all the way up to 99% duration if you really try. And you can do that twice. So you can have 200% duration basically, making this like a 20 seconds Caltrops. And the funny part is, you see this here, it scales up the maximum buff of Caltrops. So you see this here, if you keep an enemy in the Caltrops for 20 seconds, it will do more than twice the damage. And right now we also have the Victimized Rogues that actually have double dip with Caltrops. So you get 2 times this doubling effect basically. So you can get like more than ×4 damage, ×5 damage or something like that, if you go all in on a Caltrops duration and keeping an enemy in all the time consecutively. And the cool thing about this is, or well, the way that this works basically is, you can perpetuate this damage buff. So as long as the monster doesn't run out of a Caltrops field, you keep them in Caltrops slow basically. You can just put another Caltrops down and you will keep the maximum effect for the entire time basically. What it also means though is that when you have bosses in particular that run around a little bit, that move around, that disappear, Outlaw, Sharpshooter, Den Mother, Lilith, if you fight Uber Lilith, all these kind of bosses, well, you're gonna have a really bad time against those, because this bonus resets all the time. So overall, I think that just this thing has gotten out of hand, and it creates this massive gap between how you fight one boss versus the other boss, because on one boss you do double or quadruple the damage with the double dip. In other bosses you just get barely anything, because they run around all the time, or you have to run around, and then they follow you and they run out of Caltrops, and it's just so clunky to play around this, to use this, and to really get much out of it. So I think this bonus, mostly just being uncapped, is a problem. I think it's fine that Caltrops can enhance your damage. I think it's not fine that they can like double or quadruple your damage. And it just leads to these scenarios where a lot of bosses in the pit especially become kind of like absolutely terrible, thanks to, well, we had the stagger problem, but also thanks to the Caltrops. And I would really like to see maybe a bit of an adjustment there with like maybe some cap to the Caltrops, or maybe, some other tools to, make this scale better, or just be more user-friendly, maybe without the jump. Maybe there could be like a legendary aspect that removes it. Or maybe, for example, this damage buff could be like you know, slowly stacking up, but also slowly falling off, and not just like fall off all at once, for example. So there's many ways out here, but I think Caltrops in general have become kind of like too prevalent in all of the rogue builds. Like they're just like the thing to use, but they also produce these like extremely wildly different outcomes when you fight certain bosses, and it just doesn't feel good because of, well, also this Caltrops duration temper, I guess. The inconsistency of Caltrops is just way too large, I think. And again, also the inconsistency of being able to stagger a boss in the right moment, having them in the Caltrops, you know, opening up your burst window. But, you know, one time there's like a shadow boss spawning and you have to dodge around for like 5 seconds and the stagger passes. And the other time you just stand there and you shoot and you also get your inner calm effect on top of it. Well, you know, those are 2 galaxies apart in terms of damage output. And it can mean, you know, a minute or 2 or difference in the actual boss kill time at the end or so, just because you couldn't use those 5 seconds of nuke window. And I think at that point it gets a bit too extreme. So those were all of like kind of the main big topics that I have, I guess, that lead to the rogues being what they are currently. And I really hope to see some adjustments. So I try to give some suggestions here. There's a few more things I want to discuss. So we kind of like covered like most of this now, but there's also dual core builds, Paragon nodes, uniques, and ultimates. So these are like smaller topics. I want to go through them a little bit faster. So let's start off this here, dual core builds. I talked briefly about Flurry IF earlier. Flurry IF was like a very much beloved build, including for myself. A lot of people really enjoyed that, but it's also kind of like down in the gutter. Thanks to, well, what I described of melee rogues, first of all, Flurry just not really being that powerful. But then we also had like this rapid fire as like a, you know, single target damage solution to make up for the downside of Flurry having no single target damage whatsoever. So that is like one thing, but dual core builds have just like kind of like fallen off really hard because, well, I talked about precision being really powerful for range builds. So if you do like, let's say, a Flurry RF build, then you kind of want to use precision for RF, for RF to feel powerful, but you can't because precision doesn't buff the already weak Flurry. So the only way out is to go with close quarters combat. That would buff both skills, but then your rapid fire is going to be much weaker than, let's say, a normal rapid fire in like a, you know, pure rapid fire build with precision, for example. You're going to do like half the damage or something. On top of this, we also get like more uniques these days, like for example the Scoundrel's Kiss. There's also a massive damage buff to a rapid fire build. So not having Scoundrel's Kiss and not having precision will just make a rapid fire feel like a hitting with a wet noodle compared to like a real rapid fire build where you just do rapid fire and no flurry, and it's just like a way better build. So dual core builds, despite us actually getting core skill and ranks as a modifier on our glove, you know, now as a stat, instead of having, for example, to sacrifice 2 stats at the same time on a glove, it just is nowhere near like a pure build, basically. Like a 1 skill build is just massively superior thanks to all of the extra support and the extra specialization that we can put into a single skill these days. And this is not just thanks to like a unique or so, but we also have, for example, the tempers. This is also like, I guess, something that just benefits range builds a lot more than the melee builds right now. I didn't actually talk about this yet, but you also want to temper certain things on your weapons for your main skill. And if you have 2 main skills, well, you have to choose between them and you have to make concessions here. And especially those like chance to cast twice things here, they are extremely powerful for all of the range builds. So you see this here, I can get like, well, basically 100% chance if you really try. You don't even have to try that hard, actually. You can get 100% chance for Barrage to cast twice, but just tempering it with a good roll and master control without any crits. And you can do some Barrage on rapid fire, whatever. But, well, if you have 2 skills, then you have to choose, okay, do I go 50-50? Or do I just accept that, you know, this one thing is just like way more powerful than the other? But, you know, if you like heavily invest into one of the skills, then the gap kind of closes between them anyway. So what's the point really of using the second skill in the first place, right? So these core skill builds just don't really work out in the current meta because there's not enough support for like double core setups anymore. So we have, first of all, the key passes that are too specialized. We have these temperers that are too specialized, and dual core builds are just kind of like that. The same goes for 10 RF, which was another like much beloved like dual core build on the rogues lately, but it has also kind of like just fallen out of favor. You now play pure pen shot or pure rapid fire or pure flurry, but it would never really combine them anymore. It just doesn't really happen. I'm not really sure of a good way out here and a way to solve this. I guess maybe a little start could be to just make core skill ranks on gloves actually have the same number as individual ranks. So we have core skill ranks that only goes to +2, and we have individual ranks that go to +3, and that makes 0 sense whatsoever. I guess the thinking by this was that, yeah, core skills, they have like this category system, and then you have the individual skill system. It's just like you know, having, for example, defensive skills on your chest. Like if you have multiple defensive skills in your build, of course it makes sense to buff all of them a little bit less than you could buff an individual skill, because you can actually have multiple defensive skills in any build, or like subterfuge skills in the case of rogues, for example, but you cannot use multiple core skills at the same time. You can use multiple defensive skills at the same time, but you cannot use multiple core skills at the same time. So that's kind of like where this discrepancy comes from. Like buffing core skills as a category less than individual skills just doesn't make any sense. And I think it wouldn't be such a bad idea to just up the number on the core skill category affix to the same number that you can have on individual skills, because, well, you have this opportunity cost of only using one skill at a time compared to how it works with other categories. So that would be a start at least. So this could be 2 to 3, and this could be kind of like the Joker role, basically. So this is like the GG role. You can use this glove for any build, you know, feel happy about it. That would be nice. But this could be something at least to get started here. But in general, I guess what we really need is like maybe some crazy unique or so that really enables dual core setups. Not just for the rogues necessarily. I would also like to see more stuff like this on other classes, to be honest. Rogues have just kind of been traditionally like, I guess, the class that had these dual core setups. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to make like really cool, like, you know, mix and match builds where you have like a weak single target build, a good AoE skill, and then the reverse, like a good single target skill that helps with the bosses, for example. And that could also solve a lot of those boss kill issues that I talked about earlier. But then we still have the tempo issue, so I'm not really sure what to do about this. There could be maybe also something that is like maybe as a Joker role here that gives you like a chance to cast any projectile twice, for example, or, you know, somewhere along those lines. At least that would help with, like, you know, for example, Pen RF, or I don't know, maybe some other like more universal buffs that would actually help you. Because right now, for example, also the melee rogues, they don't have anything here. You have Twisting Blades returns faster, which is like completely pointless. You have Flurry Size, which is like, yeah, kind of convenient, but ultimately useless. And then you have, you know, chance to cast twice, which is like, you know, double the damage, and gives you like more lucky hits and these kind of things as well, which is like just crazy. So there's just like a lack of options here in Tempers. There's like a lack of options in like any kind of like combining skills with stats, combining skills with uniques and these kind of things. And I guess something has to be done here in the long term. Then we also have Paragon nodes. So this is also something that people like to talk about a lot. It's in particular the no witnesses here. People say, yeah, you can't really stack ultimate damage bonus anymore to buff no witnesses. That's actually untrue. You can still put diamonds in your weapons, but you just can't really stack it very much. Ultimately, no witnesses is always like kind of bad, and I guess it just needs like a massive buff. Like no one ever think about using this. This is also like the Paragon board that has the worst layout of all Paragon boards, and it has the longest path here basically to get there. So on top of this, you get rewarded with like the weakest legendary node ever. So that is just kind of like terrible, and it has an 8 seconds duration as well. So it's only really ever possible to keep this up with maybe Flicker Step if you really try hard with like Wind of Arrows or so. Otherwise, it's basically just for like exposure death trap builds, which could need a lot of help, to be honest. But yeah, we don't really play that anymore anyway. So no witnesses is kind of like dead. And then we have the Rana's Instinct, kind of a little bit of a similar story. It wants you to stack core skill damage, which also does no longer exist as a stat, but you can actually stack a pretty significant amount of this on your Paragons alone. So there is, for example, a Cunning Stratagem board that has core skill damage. If you kind of try, you can get Leana's Instinct to like a decent amount, like 25-30% damage bonus or so, but it's like too much investment, not really strong enough, and not really used for any build either. And then you have a bunch of other like important legendary nodes that are all generally kind of good. So a lot of them are actually seeing use here, but I guess the two biggest offenders here for like uselessness are definitely the Leana's Instinct and no witnesses, because they have outdated like scaling mechanisms, or they're just too weak, or both really. Other than that, I'm actually like relatively happy with like how the Paragon boards are for the rogues. There is a lot of like kind of like general viability on a lot of nodes, a lot of like generally useful stuff on most of the boards. There are like some that I generally don't necessarily go for, but can still be used in some cases. So there's not really like any board that I necessarily leave out, you know, by default on any of my builds. But there are obviously like kind of like universally good legendary nodes. For example, exploit weakness. I talked about the boss damage issues, so this helps a little bit with that, for example. And you know, other things like that. You know, Eldritch Bounty goes into like basically any ability with imbuements. It's just kind of powerful for that. And there's like good stuff all over the place. It's not like on other classes where, for example, you have like Necros and they have like this one Skelly board and the one Golem board and the one Blood board and the one Bone board or something. And there's like basically no universal boards that you would just like kind of like to pick up, you know, just because, you know. And that is kind of like good on the rogue at least, but we have definitely some issues here with some of these boards. I guess while we're at it, we can talk about the ultimate skills as well for the rogues. So all three of them are just kind of like really terrible at this point. So we do have some attempts of making Rain of Arrows somewhat not terrible anymore. So there are actually some really strong tempers that you can get for Rain of Arrows, which is not even on the weapon slot, but actually an offensive slot, interestingly. The chance to cast the Rain of Arrows waste twice. So they were very generous here, putting this on an offensive slot with a very high value. And it's also like Rain of Arrows damage, a pretty significant chunk. But I have not tested that though. And I would believe that this probably doesn't work for Poison Imbuement, which is like the way that we used to play Rain of Arrows in the past at least. So at least when I made the Rain of Arrows build back in Season 2, this was like a fully Poison Imbuement build, thanks to like these Imbuement synergies that come naturally with Rain of Arrows. And we also have the Word of Arcane, again having Imbuement synergies, and this is kind of like the Rain of Arrows item. So it kind of like pushes you naturally towards Imbuments, and this means you kind of want to do a Poison Imbuement in order to deal damage. However, maybe these days it's not necessarily true anymore because Precision Key Passive has been so mega buffed. So maybe you would actually try to make this like a crit, maybe more Cold Imbue themed or something setup. Ultimately, Rain of Arrows just has the same old problem. It's too long of a cooldown. It has a very long animation, and they have actually done some changes to this. Now the knockdown is on the first wave, the animation is faster, the cooldown has been lowered, and so on. These days we can masterwork even the cooldown reduction on the Word of Arcane if you really want. So you could actually get quite a lot of it, but the problem remains, it's like too much investment for like too little outcome. It's like a fun skill to use, just doesn't really cut it though for like any build. And it doesn't even serve like a crowd control function anymore, because crowd controls are just so prevalent now these days with tempers that, you know, even this knockdown being like kind of like, you know, you walk in and you diffuse the danger with like a single cast by knocking down the entire room. It doesn't even apply anymore because you just see everything anyway easily. So that is kind of like where Rain of Arrows is at. I'm not sure how to solve that. Yeah, I guess it just needs like lower cooldown yet again. Maybe, you know, another unique that goes with it, or like a separate unique from Word of Arcane that would maybe convert it into more of like an attack skill, or like, you know, something you can use just more frequently, or like in tandem with a core skill or something like that. I don't know. But it just doesn't really cut it, because it's like a damage dealing ultimate, and all damage dealing ultimates in the game just have like a lack of scaling options. You can't add skill ranks. There's like, you know, also no core skill synergies from, for example, all of aspects. A lot of stuff is just missing here. Combo points, for example, you can't do that with Rain of Arrows. So they just always fall behind in the late game with all of the scaling mechanisms that we have for other builds. So it's like a general disease of ultimates that are supposed to deal damage. And here's another example of that, even with all the support we have. Then we have the Shadow Clone. Oh boy. So apparently, according to the devs, the Shadow Clones are fine because they gain 100% of your stats, and that might actually be somewhat true. And, well, we have been waiting for Shadow Clone fixes for like a year now, and nothing has happened. Shadow Clone by itself is actually a really cool concept. There was a short period very long ago when I wasn't aware of how broken the skill is, in the bad way, where I was actually using Shadow Clone until I realized what is happening. And to this day, there are still some people that believe that this is a good skill, which is kind of, yeah, I guess you can kind of understand why, because it does look good on paper. If you look at it, it says, wow, the clone deals 6% of your damage, 80 in fact, and you get some unstoppable on top of it. What a cool skill, you think, right? It has a 60 seconds cooldown, 15 seconds duration, so it has a very good uptime by default, and you would think, wow, this is crazy. Well, it turns out that basically nothing works with this. Like, legendary aspects don't work with this, damage modifiers don't work with this, and this thing hits for literally nothing. You can hit for like, you know, 10 million, and this thing can hit for 10,000 maybe. So it's completely laughable, and it's ultimately just a noob trap for people that think that this is actually a good skill, and it needs a lot of changes. Like, if I was Blizzard, I would probably just sit it out, and I would just like scrap the skill entirely in the expansion, put another shadow theme skill and be done with it, because I don't think there's really any hope of saving this. Even if they try, I don't expect that devs will get this right in the first try at least. So this is what I would suggest, honestly. I do like the concept of Shadow Clone, but even under the scenario that this is completely fixed, you still have the problem that, for example, you know, if you shoot pen shot, your Shadow Clone will just shoot pen shot into nowhere, and the same might happen with rapid fire. Or you do twisting blades, and you have to, you know, use the returning blades and move in the right position, and the Shadow Clone won't move anywhere. And, you know, use Flurry, and you have the circular AoE of Flurry, and the Shadow Clone will just spawn somewhere on the outside and just hit like 2 guys. So there's a lot of problems, even if they fix everything, and the Shadow Clone deals the damage it's supposed to do. So, yeah. I'm not sure where we're gonna go here, but I would not be surprised to see this just be entirely scrapped soon. And then we have Death Trap, and Death Trap is a really cool skill. I really like Death Trap. It's like probably my favorite skill in the game, I would say. And it just turns out, well, again, it's a damage dealing ultimate. Damage dealing with ultimates is not a thing, so it's exclusively used for utility. So we have to pull, which is really cool. It just feels nice to use Death Trap and pull in an entire pack into like 1 pixel and then blast them down. There are some synergies, you know, you can follow up with like a poison trap for a knockdown. You can follow up with a smoke grenade. You have like, you know, shadow imbuement pops that, you know, it gets better because they're more stacked up. There's a lot of really cool stuff with Death Trap. I really love that skill. But for example, this upgrade here with like it kills an enemy, gets a lower cooldown, kind of pointless because Death Trap will never kill anything, at least on like any kind of like high-end scenario. And well, we have like exposure key passive that I talked about at length earlier. It just doesn't really cut it. It's like the way to play Death Trap really with exposure. So you can actually use it very frequently, up to like once a second or so, because you can reset it very quickly with exposure. So that's potentially kind of game breaking in some scenarios. But yeah, ultimately it's just also just not really strong enough. It has too long of a cooldown when you don't run exposure. Maybe you could see some adjustments to exposure, not having this ridiculous amount of cooldown reduction, but have more like, you know, lower base cooldown, for example, for Death Trap, so that it becomes more universal for other builds that don't run exposure or something like that. So that would be cool. And otherwise, yeah, we're kind of like in a bad spot here for ultimates. Like, there's no rogue build that really runs any ultimates, and it's kind of sad. And lastly, we have the uniques here. So this is also just like a general problem with the game right now, but I guess we couldn't go talk through those here real quick. So there's a list of the uniques here. There's basically not a single unique that is used for any rogue build outside of Scoundrel's Kiss, which is like the new big thing for rapid fire, and maybe Harlequin Crest, but that's an uber unique, available to all classes, and just generally the best item in the game. So it's not really surprising that rogues also want to use that. But basically all of the rogue uniques are just kind of like trash tier, I would say. Some because, for example, the build that is associated with it is just terrible, like Word of Arcan, Rain of Arrows is just like not a thing. Then we have Grasp of Shadow, we have the Shadow Clone problem here, so it's just broken, it doesn't do anything. And then we have like all these bows, for example, like weapons, uniques, doesn't really work these days because of the crazy tempers. So until we get like a general update to these, yeah, we won't reuse any of these. Even the Sky Hunter, that was like, you know, one of the craziest items up until recently in the entire game, I would say, has just kind of like fallen off. You would never think about using it because weapons and the tempers on weapons are just so powerful. So there needs to be like a massive shift here. And, well, something like Sky Hunter also doesn't really do anything interesting, really. It's just like, yeah, more damage, basically. So you would just use whatever option gives you the most, and that's basically it. And at least we have some kind of like interesting effects like this pen shot thing here. But even in the past, when we didn't have tempers, no one would use Eagle Horn over normal crossbow, for example, because this effect is just too weak. Like, vulnerable is not really a difficult effect to apply for rogues. You have like this bouncy shot that goes off into nowhere, that doesn't really make any sense. So I think we need like a redesign on some of these effects as well. Maybe, for example, for pen shot, this could be like more of a homing missile. So it could like naturally benefit the single target damage more of pen shot compared to the AoE damage, for example, because, you know, they would not necessarily hit the pack as well as it does. It's just hitting one target. So right now you have this bouncy thing with the walls here, and it's like kind of weird. Even under the scenario that they mega buff this bow, it just doesn't feel great to use either. So yeah. We also have stuff like Condemnation that used to be a very powerful item, especially for combo point builds, and now it's just kind of useless again thanks to the Temperers. Ashiras Kanjar is just outclassed by any normal weapon basically. Ice in the Dark that has like no purpose whatsoever, because, well, even if you cast multiple death traps and they go off all the time, like, what are you even doing? Like, why would you need this effect? Like, you know, the game is too fast paced for an item like this to work basically. So it doesn't make any sense, I think. And there's like more examples like that. Basically all of these items just don't really serve a purpose here anymore, or have never had one really. So I think we need some general like huge updates, like more interesting effects, more cool combos that are enabled by these items, because some of these uniques that just have stats basically, like Call of the Nameless for example, it's basically just a stat stick. It doesn't really do anything. And considering this is like a Duriel drop, you know, like the highest of the boss ladder bosses basically, this is a joke for how weak this item is, for example. So it doesn't really make sense with like also how the items are distributed along the different bosses and the difficulty when you get to acquire those items. And well, you would never even think about using them in the first place sometimes. I think an example of a really cool item is Scoundrel's Letters here. This has a really cool concept at least. However, in practice it just doesn't really work out because it's just too weak. It's like too understated. The effect is too inconsistent. But if that effect was more consistent, you know, if you would actually spawn, let's say, all 3 of them at the same time, and you wouldn't have to rely on the RNG of getting like 3 poison traps in a row instead of the death trap at some point, or the Caltrops at some point, or something like that, then that could be a really cool item, and actually something that would be really fun to play with. But it also has some weird bugs. For example, on PC, you can play a melee build, and you can spawn these traps at range by just mousing over an enemy. I actually made a video about this. It's kind of hilarious. You can like kind of cast traps at range like this, and in fact, if you don't have a target, you don't cast any traps at all. So that's a kind of funny bug that goes with this item as well, at least for PC users or mouse and keyboard users. So this is something that I'd like to see more of, at least if it was fixed and actually working properly, because this is something really cool and interesting. Even like the Eagle Horn is kind of like interesting. It's just like not feeling good, I guess. But yeah, stuff like Call of the Nameless, stuff like Ashiras Kanjar, we don't need those items. I feel like they don't really serve much of a purpose. They're just kind of stat sticks. They don't do anything interesting. So I'm not really sure why we should have these effects on these items. So this sums up this video here. Hope you follow me all the way through. Let me know what you think about it. If you have some other thoughts or some other suggestions or whatever. This went pretty long now. And I do hope that maybe the devs will listen to some of these things I said. Maybe come up with some other cool ideas that I didn't think of now. I mean, they are the devs after all. And let's see what happens. But I try to like lay out the problems that we have with the class, with the different builds, with the different scaling mechanisms that exist. Let's see if we're gonna get some adjustments in the future. So let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed my video here. Stay tuned for more stuff, and I'll see you guys next time.